Good evening, everybody. It's been a while. We haven't been able to stream, or we haven't streamed live on lessons in African American history in a while. I'm excited to come to do a lesson. I'm going to do it in a series. I thought I was going to do this in one larger lesson, but I want to take this in steps. I've been talking, and I have a post in here probably about a month ago about the impacts of Abraham Lincoln, the radical Republicans of the 1860s, and the impacts of what we know as the Reconstruction Amendments in the United States, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment. So today, I'm going to talk about the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. There's been a lot of discussion here recently about African Americans and their politics and how the majority of African Americans vote Democratic. Many Republicans today look back to the days of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party of the 1860s to make a case that African Americans should be Republicans as opposed to Democrats today. And there's a larger discussion that we would need to have in order to understand the changes in the parties and the platforms that they held in the 1860s, even up to the 1950s and 60s and today. But I wanted to have a conversation about the Republicans of the 1860s, the positions that they held, the impacts of the laws that were passed during that time. We'll come back and talk later about some civil rights acts that were passed in the 1860s, post-Civil War as well. But today, I want to spend some time talking about the 13th Amendment and some impacts of this amendment on African Americans and other groups even today. So I want to share my screen to show some information that I want to focus on today. So with that being said, in 1865, this amendment was passed. It is the 13th Amendment. It reads like this. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, should exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And then section 2 says, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So in order to really have a conversation about this, really looking at this amendment, the first thing we have to remember is a conversation that happened a couple years prior to this, and that is the Emancipation Proclamation. Many people will argue that if there was an Emancipation Proclamation that ended slavery, why would there be a need for the 13th Amendment? Well, first of all, the Emancipation Proclamation, I argue, did not free anyone because that document said that it only freed slaves in states that was in rebellion to the Union on January 1st, 1863. The problem with that is that the president of the United States, namely Abraham Lincoln, was not the president of the Confederate States of America. And as a war act, he passed this Emancipation Proclamation, that if indeed there was a Confederate States of America, several states that had rebelled from the Union or from the United States, and it had its own government with its own president, then Abraham Lincoln had no power in those countries, in that country. In addition to that, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free anyone in states that did not rebel, states like West Virginia, states like Kansas, those states that did not rebel, the Emancipation Proclamation did nothing. There were other areas, some places in Louisiana, for example, where those states, internal to those states, there were parts of the state that was under federal control, and the states or the Emancipation Proclamation did not free those individuals either. Now, at the end of the Civil War, the United States would begin to impose its will in 1865 or 1864, would begin to impose its will on those areas that they won in at the end of the war. But this amendment was needed. I would say the Emancipation Proclamation began to lay the groundwork, if you will, for what we would see here as the 13th Amendment. So it says again, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. Let me take the parenthetical, the piece that is that is set off in commas out. And then I want to come back to it. Without that, it would read this way: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or in any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now, this would have been a great amendment had it read that way. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. This, written that way, would have settled for good the issue of slavery in this country. But because of this except clause that is in this amendment that says, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, because of that except clause, there are many people who argue that today it has led to this thing called mass incarceration and employing of criminals as slaves for either very small wages or no wages at all. Because of the prison population, the explosion of the prison population in this country, 5% of the world's population with 25% of the world's prisoners in the land of the free. In this country, the land of the free, 5% of the world's population houses 25% of its prisoners. It is because one of the reasons is because there's a lot of money made on the backs of prisoners. It did not start today. And the reason why I make that claim now is I'm going to go back to the days of this amendment and show you how it has always been used to make money off of prisoners. So in 1865, when this amendment was passed, for many of the southern states, it was used as a precondition to readmission, that if you wanted to be readmitted to the United States, this amendment was a precondition to readmission, that those states would have to accept this amendment, vote yes on this amendment in order to be readmitted into the Union. So in 1865, that took place. And before the end of the war, there was a thing, or before the end of slavery, there were these things they were called slave codes. Slave codes, they were laws that only applied to the slave population, that if they committed these crimes under the slave codes, they could be punished. Now, those punishments did not end up with, say, prison time in most cases, because prisoners or slaves, if you will, slaves were actually purchased. A healthy slave, male slave, in 1860 would cost or could cost between $1,000 and $2,000. A healthy female slave, a couple $100 less. So in 1860, just before the Civil War, in 1861, a healthy Black male slave between $1,000 to $2,000, and a healthy female slave, a couple $100 less than that. At the end of slavery, the slave codes were changed to Black codes, and the slave codes were changed to Black codes. And as people were arrested for things like vagrancy or loitering or carrying a weapon or other laws that only apply to the African American population, they were then imprisoned and then leased out through what was called convict lease. So that healthy Black male slave in 1860 that cost between $1,000 and $2,000 now could be leased for as little as $10 to $25. And it would depend on the size of the organization that wanted it, whether it was back on plantations to harvest crops or on the railroads to build the railroads or the corporations. They would lease them now from $10 to $25. As I said, the range would vary based on the number of slaves leased and the company that was leasing them. So think about this. a slave that cost $1,000 to $2,000 in 1860, mind you, that would be a reason why you would want that slave to stay alive. It was a very hefty investment. An acre of land was $1.20. A healthy black male slave between $1,000 and $2,000. An enormous amount of money, considering there were about 4 million slaves at the end of slavery. Think about that. An incredible, enormous amount in the Southern economy at the time. Now could be leased for $10 to $25. There's a book, it's called One Dies by Another, because there was no longer a real impetus to keep that person alive. So many times they would literally work them to death. Some people would say, well, if they could just work off their lease, then they could be free, which was true. But the challenge or the problem with that many times was that the lease, though it was $10 to $25, they would then be charged for housing and clothing and food. And so you would never pay off your lease, and you would find stories later about individuals, even though slavery was over, were escaping from plantations and other places, much like they were prior to the end of slavery. The conditions were worse than slavery because the cost of the workforce had become much, much cheaper as a result. So I'm going to share my screen again here, and I want to show you what this would eventually lead to. So you would end up with this amendment, because of the except clause, you would end up with what we call convict lease, where slaves, again, that cost between $1,000 and $2,000 were now leased for fractions of the cost. And so as a result, there you would find this picture are orphans or youth offenders who were now convicts who were being leased to work a plantation. This is immediately after slavery. And so this process of using slave or using convict labor at the end of slavery happened immediately after the end of slavery. So it's slavery by another name. Convicts would have no rights in the same way that slaves had no rights. And so they would take these prison populations. There were some places, African Americans in the South were so few in the prison system in the 1860s that they did not even separate the population by color back in those days, because the numbers of African Americans enslaved or in prisons were so few. That would change by 1880. That in Georgia alone, 40% of the population in Georgia were in prisons by 1880, and were being used now as convicts to be leased out for corporations because they were cheap. They were a cheap labor force. They would continue on, in this particular case, working on farms. And so from this process that started immediately after slavery, it continues till today. And so today, 1 in 3 African American men have a chance of going to prison during their lives. All of this is rooted in a system that was created at the end of slavery through a process called convict lease. And now with the growth of private prisons and the leasing out of convict labor to work for some of the corporations, even today, that we are buying our products from, 1 in 17 white men have a chance of going to prison. How does this break out by race and gender? All men in this country, 1 in 9, have a chance of going to prison. White men, again, 1 in 17. Black men, 1 in 3. Latino men, 1 in 6. All women have a 1 in 56 chance. But look at this. White women have a 1 in 111 chance. Black women have a 1 in 18 chance, and Latino women a 1 in 45 chance. This is a 2003 study by the Sentencing Project, and I'm going to continue to look to find the more recent numbers on this. But some will argue that this is because by race, people are more prone to crime or violent behavior. I will argue just the opposite. That it is, we have decided what crimes are criminalized in the same way in the 1860s through the convict lease system and the black codes that were crimes at that time specifically aimed at African American people, particularly African American men, but not only men. And it was not only African Americans who were released as convicts, but the numbers by race are staggering by comparison. I think that's my last slide, as I'm going to go into the 14th Amendment in the next video. But I just wanted to spend some time to talk a little bit about this amendment, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, its impacts on our country. And so while individuals are talking about these incredible things that Abraham Lincoln and the radical Republicans of the 1860s, the work that they did to address the issues of race in this country, I wanted to show you this amendment, and based on the accept clause in the 13th Amendment, the impacts of that amendment. And some people will say that this led to mass incarceration today. But I'm telling you that the challenges that we faced with this amendment started immediately after its ratification in 1865. And it has been used, one, to mass incarcerate African Americans immediately after slavery, and then to turn around and use them on the very same plantations, on the railroads, and to push the economic agendas of this country in the 1860s. And while there are challenges that we face today because of this amendment, those challenges are rooted in the decisions that were made over 150 years ago in America, when they ratified this amendment, and because of this accept clause, they put it there so that they could do it immediately after slavery. All right, everybody, I hope this piqued your interest. I encourage you to do some of your own research. I hope that the page Lessons in African American History will help to sharpen your focus as it relates to the things that we are learning about African American history in this country, and then also encouraging us to continue the conversation with one another and with others as we're looking for ways to better address the legal apparatus of this country for all people. And so I encourage you to look up the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, look up convict lease, and figure out some ways that we can learn more relative to these topics that we're studying. I hope you have a wonderful day. Look forward to the next time I come. I will talk a little bit about the 14th Amendment and then the 15th Amendment. We call those the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment that were ratified during Reconstruction in this country. Have a wonderful day, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope this lesson taught you a little bit more about African American history. Have a great evening.